Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with my Game Week 30 cheat sheet preview. Now this is a massive week just because we have a few managers who have diverged in certain paths here. Either a manager who's going for a free hit in 30, probably positioned yourself with Man City and Chelsea players and are happy to play the rest of the season with a very strong squad ahead, or you're a manager who's probably positioned around Arsenal and Spurs players, maybe keeping triple Liverpool as well, going for a little bit more of aggressive play and playing around 30 with probably around 8 to 9 or even 10 players ready to make a transfer for, let's say, an additional Arsenal or Spurs player or someone to cover the week, such as a Leicester player. I think if you're not looking at a free hit, it is very sensible now to look at Leicester players because we know that they have double game weeks to come. We have some options too with Vardy out where you could probably look at once again the midfielders. And we once again have a crowding of the midfield position where it seems like the bulk of our teams will have 5 midfielders. I also think a crucial point in this week is whether you keep Son or maybe make a little bit more of an aggressive move and go towards Kane. The positive of Kane, even though he's much more expensive than Son, and perhaps not actually more worth it, is that sort of vague quality of him being a little bit of a better captaincy shout just because he's on penalties and has looked really good as of late, with Son not exactly the best in form. And also the opportunity, as I said, to go for another midfielder. Because if you're looking at a lot of teams who now have gone triple Spurs or at least double Spurs, they do incorporate a structure where probably they've gone for Son just because of how much cheaper he is. But we are now at a point in the season where a lot of us have accumulated a lot of team value. There's no need, for example, for those who have kept a bench boost to actually have, let's say, a playing team of 15. And so for that reason, you do have the opportunity to actually go for a much more cheaper team with budget options such as Broja to keep them on your team, or Gelhardt, or even keeping Ramsey or Gordon in your team, which allows for a much more stronger starting 11 as we head towards the end of the season. If you have a lot of your chips in hand and you still have the bench boost, then that probably isn't relevant to you. But many things to sort of consider this week. This is a week where I think at the very minimum, you should probably want to have 7 players. Otherwise, I think a free hit is definitely an option for you as a player. I wouldn't really mind taking one hit probably to get to 7 to 8 players. I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that's sort of the barrier where you're probably expecting something between a small red if you get the right players, or a small green for the same sort of logic. If we head into towards the defenders, what I've done this week specifically is actually I've narrowed out all the players who don't actually play in game week 30. Here we have so many players across the league who have players like Rafinha, so that's a very, very good coverage of leads. But when we look at Wolves, we're probably looking at defenders, and this is a great week to sort of cover them if you're looking for a free hit. If you're looking for an Arsenal player, one thing I will say is that I think Ramsdale is very good at sort of just covering the defense of Arsenal. One trap that I think I fell into personally was going for the double Arsenal defense in game week 26, and I much rather now, on retrospect, would probably like to go for 2 attacking Arsenal players over 2 defensive Arsenal players, just because of the way Arsenal have trended lately. They do have very good quality individual defenders, but I think that's sort of why you probably just want to have Ramsey on your team. And he showcased that in the previous week versus Leicester when he made a fantastic save versus Barnes. So that's sort of food for thought for a player who's looking to make an additional transfer this week. As a result of this, I have dropped Tierney this week. As you can see, he drops with Ait-Nouri. Ait-Nouri, once again, I'm not going to be probably baited to actually ever rise him again for the rest of the season unless he plays for something like 4 to 5 games in a row. There's just too much rotation now with Marcel, especially in a little bit more of a tight and congested point of the season, and there's no real reason to have him in your team. For me, Cody has always been the best option. He's the player who's sitting on my team. Saiss is also a great player to have, and we know Semedo continues to be injured. So there's no real reason to play around with players like Kilman, who have shown a little bit of ability to be rotated by the manager now, with Bully maybe coming back into the picture. Dawson for me is one of those big transfers in this week here, where if you're looking for a free hit, I actually think he could be quite a good differential. A lot of people will be opting for Spurs defenders, but I would say betting on a West Ham to blank versus Spurs is probably a little bit of a reach. I don't think the Spurs defense have been electric lately. The one positive of going for a Spurs defender, though, is actually the fact that they actually occupy such offensive and attacking regions in the pitch. Even if you watch that Man United game last week where they did struggle to actually end up scoring, they were actually creating a lot of very good effective chances, and that was still being utilized by the fullbacks pushing up high in the field. If you were watching the game, you might be reminded of when Kane, in an offside position, actually took the ball sort of away from Doherty, who was actually in a great position to score. And that's sort of the value of having Doherty in your team. I think he's also a much better player than Emerson, which is something that I've been sort of touting lately, and that's why Doherty sits so highly. I think even in the double later on this week, he probably will still play. A good mark, I think, of what Conte sees in players is that if he feels like he can't be supported by a player, or if he feels like he's not going to get utility from a player, he's very happy to take them off the field. And we've seen substitutions happen to players like Reguilon and Emerson in the past. The fact that Doherty was actually kept on for the full Man United game, for me, is a good sign to show and to highlight that Conte actually has him very high in his estimations. And personally, I think Doherty has been playing very well lately, and is definitely still not a trap. We'll see what happens. I might be wrong, and he might blank versus Brighton, but I'm still quite confident about the pick. If you're not confident about Doherty and you're worried about rotation, then the simple option is to go for the other rise in Reguilon. Reguilon, by contrast, is another fullback who does very well. I thought he didn't play particularly well in the Man United game. The benefit that he does have is he probably has a locked-in position just because no one can really contest that left wing back spot. I don't really think Davies can fill in that position. We've seen Davies occupy attacking places, and he did score, for example, in open play versus Norwich earlier on in the season, but I really think he can't match the sort of output that Reguilon has as someone bombarding down the left flank, and I think the physicality is probably the difference there in terms of technical play. As far as cash, I've actually dropped him this week. One of the big things for Aston Villa was the loss of Dean, and he's also fallen alongside his other fullback partner. And the main thing for Dean, of course, is the injury sort of situation, which is very concerning. As far as cash, though, I would say Aston Villa, as I mentioned, have a very, very tough run of games ahead. And despite cash being or looking like such a great option, I would say he would be a little bit of a trap for this week to go for as a defender. I do think this Arsenal team are very promising at scoring, and that's specifically why I've actually dropped cash for this week, just to kind of tell people to shy away from opting to go against Arsenal. I think Arsenal are definitely one of the most informed teams in the league. If you look at points or even expected points for the last 5 to 10 fixtures, they're actually hand in hand with teams such as Liverpool and Man City. And that shows you the sort of devastating quality that Arsenal have at their disposal right now. I've moved the keepers now to sit alongside the defenders this week, and that's why you can see players like Sa and Schmeichel here. Sa definitely rises this week. I think over the course of the season, we've mentioned that Sa and Ramsey are clearly the two best defending keepers in FPL, just because they bribe so many save points and get those bonus points for you. Sa is someone who's actually even better for that. We've seen Wolves actually concede a lot of shots on target, not necessarily high sort of effective shots, but a lot of shots overall. And the defenders and the centre backs from Wolves also sort of get in a lot of points, similarly to the way that Arsenal did in the previous match, where Ben White was able to get bonus points too. Schmeichel this week is a very good differential. I think he is very, very sensible for a free hit, and I'll probably include him as one of my keepers in the free hit video, just because he actually allows you to probably get a Wolves defender who could score, from a set piece, or even an Arsenal player in Tierney or Gabriel, or even just the option, as I mentioned with Arsenal, to actually go for the two midfielders, or the two attackers, with Lacazette being an option for Arsenal, which means that you could probably avoid Ramsdale this week as well if you want to be covered by an Arsenal defender. So that's another option for those sort of free hitters, but Schmeichel is more focused around this free hit. And the same thing with Dawson as well. I think he's always been one of the central threats. With Antonio being out as well, it's really between him and Souček for being that sort of set-piece threat, which West Ham actually are very reliant on, to be quite honest. Now let's move on to the midfielders. The midfielders here are similar, where, once again, we have the concentration of players who only play in Game Week 30. Ramsey is a great option for the rest of the season, but for this specific week, I think the option has to be Coutinho when we're talking about covering Aston Villa. I think Aston Villa have been an electric side as of late. They've scored plenty of goals. And the tricky thing, of course, is making sure that you actually get the right Aston Villa in the right game. I'm sure not many people predicted Cash to be the king of the game week when we had the double for Aston Villa, but Coutinho is a very solid option, and it was very paramount that he is still the central piece in this team driving the offense. We have players like Buendia too, playing a very, very great sort of off-the-bench role for this team, and he could be a good option, but I think he's a bit too much of a differential. You also have the option of going for players like Ings and Watkins, who I'll discuss shortly, but I really think to cover Aston Villa, and you might not get it right every week, is going to be Coutinho. I think he's the safest pick if you're going for a free hit. If you're a player who's actually just looking to circumvent this week, I think the priority in the midfield is actually probably going to go for is to actually opt for a Leicester midfielder. My personal pick would be Barnes, who's risen in this week's cheat sheet. And the reason why is because Barnes lately has been the sort of leading player for this Leicester team as Vardy has been out in expected goal involvement. Barnes has looked like a very, very creative player and a very direct player, and exactly why we sort of touted him as a great option at the start of the season. I think he's sort of finally hitting that sort of peak that he hit in the previous year before he succumbed to his injury. And I think that's the special thing with Barnes. You could look at that Ramsdale save again. Barnes is very direct. He has that sort of goal scorer forward type threat where he's able to score in a multitude of different ways. And I think the difference with Maddison, of course, is that he will play a little bit deeper. He does link up very well with Barnes on the left, but he's also a creative option who can also shoot from range. Both of these players have the sort of finesse shot from the left-hand side, cutting in from the left in their pocket. But Maddison could be the more explosive hauler. I think Barnes is someone who might be a little bit nailed for just that one assist or that one goal, just because he's so direct, and he kind of reminds me of Saka in that sense for this sort of Leicester side. I think Saka is a great option this week. I think he's an absolute must on a free hit. You might want to obviously go and divert away from that to go for another player who's very direct in Martinelli. You then have the other option who have risen this week in Odegaard. Odegaard is interesting because he's much different between Saka and Martinelli. Now in this sort of Arsenal structure, you see him playing almost as a central midfielder like he did play in Real Sociedad. He plays like a visionary player who actually provides quite a lot of contribution from the defensive point of things, and then actually finds a lot of space to push up and then create these chances. So last match, we actually saw plenty of opportunities with him finding through balls for both Martinelli and Odegaard, whether it was dinked chips, sort of nifty little lobs, but his technical quality is class, and I think that's also a great comparison to someone who's right next to him in this list, who could be a great differential for the free hit this week, in Eriksen. Eriksen, of course, as we're reminded from his sort of Spurs tenure and in general over his career with the Danish national team, is a big focal point, I think, of this Brentford and their sort of increase in creativity lately. Yes, they've scored versus some very weak teams, and I think when you're looking at an option like Tony, you have to understand that part of the reason why he's such a great option is because of those sort of recent games with Norwich and Burnley, who are some of the weakest oppositions in the league, and the sort of penalty involvements that he's gotten. He might not actually get that versus Leicester side, who've actually shown to be rather competent. I thought they defended very well versus Arsenal, even though Arsenal actually created a lot of high effective chances, and you'll actually see that with the expected goals. Arsenal probably actually underscored what they should have scored, similar to, for example, Palace when they met versus a very potent City side that only managed to score nothing yesterday. So that's sort of my sentiments around the midfield. I really think that maybe as a non-free hitter, the option could really be to go for a Leicester player. If you don't have someone like Saka / Martinelli / Lacazette in your team, then perhaps that would be the priority for now. But I think Maddison and Barnes are interesting because they're great options with a lot of good games in hand. And as we mentioned many weeks back when we were actually thinking about going for Leicester players and we opted for Maddison on the wild card, the sort of rescheduled fixtures for Leicester are really, really good compared to a team like Arsenal, who still has to play Liverpool this week, for example, and also has to play Chelsea in one of the rescheduled games. That's sort of the big upside there. I thought Rafinha was also exceptional in the previous week in his match versus Norwich. Yes, of course, he was playing versus Norwich, but once again, he showed why he is one of the better players in FPL. He's clearly not a captaincy option, which was a point well proven in the previous double game week. But I think the point is to say that Rafinha might not be the sort of easiest option to kick out of your team right now after such a scintillating performance versus Norwich. And I think he might be someone that you might be tempted to keep. He could also be a good transition into someone like Barnes the week after this. So it's really up to you, but keep in mind that they will be facing Watford very, very shortly. If you're on a free hit and you're a little bit scared of, let's say, going too deeply into Spurs, perhaps you're not too fond of Spurs and you don't want to go triple Spurs, you could definitely try and hedge a little bit by going for a West Ham player, and that's sort of why I brought in Benrahma and Fornals into this cheat sheet. They both looked very, very good. Once again, it's sort of this situation with these West Ham midfielders where they're all very good, and at many points in the season we've seen great form from each of them. Fornals is a player who has been quiet lately, and Benrahma has quietly been sort of accumulating assists, but not really being a sort of goal threat like he was in the preseason and then in the early parts of the year. Bowen, of course, was that sort of mantelpiece and that sort of talismanic option throughout the midway of the season up until recently when he got injured. But now that I think he's out of the team and Antonio's out of the team will be very reliant in open play, at least from Benrahma and Fornals, and even Lanzini as a potential outside shot. You could maybe opt for him. He's always a player who looks like an interesting option, an explosive option in a sort of free hit situation. So you could look out for him too. But as I mentioned, if you want to cover the Spurs game and you're a little bit fearful of West Ham, I do think it does make sense to go for a West Ham option in the midfield. Once again, the trick is getting the right 5 midfielders this week, whether you're free hitting or whether you're just going for a regular team. You probably would like to keep Salah, which means you're restricted to 4 players. And that probably means that you might be pivoting out of Son and going into Kane, maybe going for either an Arsenal or Leicester player. And I think both of them are very well suited for the weeks ahead, just if you look at expected points and someone who has a little bit of permanence in your team, just because of how well valued Saka is and how interesting Barnes has been in terms of increasing his stats. If we go into the forward positions, just to round things off, you have Gelhardt, who is a great option, I think, as a bench piece on the sort of free hit. He's also another great piece where if you're a player who I mentioned has already bench boosted at this point in the season, you have the opportunity here to go for Gelhardt and to sort of be that complete little bench piece. I didn't think Bamford was back to full fitness, and that's why I think he only played 45 minutes in the previous match. But Gelhardt did score at the dying stage of the game with a great Rafinha assist, pretty much driving the ball all the way to goal, leaving a tap in for Gelhardt. But I think Gelhardt, over the course of this year, has actually shown that he is a very exciting up-and-coming player, and that's because he's so direct as a player. He's got the physical attributes in terms of the pace, but he also has a very quick first foot, and I think that's something that a lot of modern strikers do need. You'll see a player like Broja, very silky as well with his sort of touch, and that's sort of what I think Gelhardt presents for this team positionally, and he might not have the same sort of, I would say, drive as someone like Bamford, who makes very targeted presses. He has the same sort of energy as Bamford, and maybe we'll see how Marsh sort of maybe accumulates Gelhardt back into the starting side and whether he gets more minutes. But he's basically the best 4.5-ish player in the game and someone that you should probably look at if you want to sort of fix up your bench for the rest of the season. As far as Hwang, he's in a void just because he's injured, and also just I don't think he makes a lot of sense as an option. We're sort of arriving at the end of how long you'd like to hold these Wolves players, and I wouldn't really recommend holding more than 1 or 2 players towards the end of the season. Hwang's probably a player that I'd like to avoid, similar to how Broja is someone who is falling off a lot of managers and their radars. Tony is the one who rises. I think he's just a very logical move that hopefully covers you for the Brentford versus Leicester game. You could arguably say that this team has enjoyed playing alongside Eriksen, has enjoyed a little bit more creativity, and has found their sort of goal-scoring ability, and it's all been centered really around Tony these last few weeks, where he's found a lot of opportunities to score, to create chances for himself and for this team, mostly through the headers and also just the penalties that he's accumulated. Once again, I think that does inflate his sort of open play stats. If you sort of remove the penalties, that he doesn't look as exciting as an option. But when you really look at the forwards, I think even without the players, including the players who are missing in game week 30, I actually think Tony is still a very, very logical option. I'd still prefer him over options from Watford, even though Cucho has looked really exciting. I'd still prefer him over Weghorst, who was subbed off recently in the most recent Burnley game versus Brentford themselves. And that's sort of why Tony holds such an interesting position in FPL right now. I think he might be the default transfer for a lot of people who are not interested in getting another Arsenal player, not interested in getting another Spurs player, and maybe not interested in getting a midfielder from Leicester, just because Daka doesn't seem to be a very present option right now, and that's why Tony is sort of at that top of the list. As far as players like Watkins and Ings and Jimenez, I feel like they all hold similar positions to in the previous weeks. As I mentioned with Watkins, I really don't think he's the focal point of this Aston Villa team anymore. The underlying stats seem to support that as well. Much more sort of underlying expected goal involvements for the other players who are supporting Watkins, and I think he is playing very much as a decoy in this team. Ings for me is an option that you'd avoid. I know he looked really good in the double game week. Maybe another option for a free hit if you are someone who like to sidestep Coutinho in the midfield and maybe opt for a Leicester player. That's an option too. Bamford is once again a differential. I think he still probably needs at least 2 to 3 weeks to actually regain his fitness, and so many games over so short rest time or rest periods is going to be extremely tough for his body, and I don't think he's going to be a good option that you'd like to pick up now. The same goes for someone like Antonio, who is unfortunately injured based on the last sort of viewing of West Ham. As far as real options this week, we're really talking about Lacazette and Kane. Apologies, sorry, I didn't actually color the rise in for Kane, but he has absolutely risen this week. Kane has been a fantastic option for the previous weeks, and just going towards the end of the season, he could be a keeper that you could go for. Obviously, Bruno will actually have a little bit of a lightening of his load in terms of having great games. You might even want to opt to go back into some sort of Man City midfielders who still look like a fantastic team. But Kane, for the most part, in the Spurs team have accumulated fantastic underlying creative and attacking stats, and Kane has been the main recipient of them alongside Son, whereas Kulusevski is playing a much more creative role in this team. And I think that sort of burden being taken off Kane has actually allowed him to sort of assume his role as the primary goal scorer of this team, and that's why I think he's such a lethal option. That, in part with Son's sort of drop in form in terms of his clinical finishing, means for me that I think with Kane's improvement in finishing, that he probably is the better option to round the season off with if you'd like to free up a little bit of more space in the midfield to go for other teams such as Arsenal and Leicester in this week. Lacazette is a great option too if you'd like to cover Arsenal in a different sort of way, just because, as I mentioned, with the midfield positions being so congested, if you're a player who's, let's say, going for Son, doesn't want to go away from Son, then Lacazette could be a good option to maybe hopefully cover players like Saka and Martinelli. The weird thing, though, is when you actually add up Kane and Saka in price, it's actually cheaper than Lacazette and Son. And just for that reason alone, I think it might be worth it while to go for a -4 as we opt towards maybe beefing up our defense as we end and head towards the end of the season. And that's pretty much it for this cheat sheet, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'm going to leave the video at the sort of cheat sheet fully. You can maybe enjoy the sort of rest of the changes, and I've actually incorporated a lot of the players who will be playing for Game Week 30 and beyond. So that sort of sets apart teams and players who will be sort of missing the blank game week, but will be extremely interesting for the road ahead as we head towards the end of the season. And that's it. So I thank you guys so much for watching the video, and I'll see you guys very shortly. If you'd like to support the channel, you can feel free to join as a member of the channel. We have 3 sort of different tiers right now, which basically reflect whatever support you'd like to provide that is comfortable to you. As a member of this channel, you'll be able to sit on the sort of Hall of Fame segment at the end of these videos, and you'll also be given access to a private chat on Discord where you can contact me at any time with any sort of questions that you have with your team or general questions if you'd like to have a chat. We also do catch-ups as a team on a weekly basis, so please feel free to join as a member if you'd like. Thank you guys so much for watching the video.